This is the lecture for the wood and architecture assignment. As most of you who've had me as an instructor, you would know that I love my puns. So this assignment, wood and architecture, wouldn't you like to know what this is all about? So the idea behind this particular project is to choose a piece of architecture. You are to create a design influenced off of a piece of architecture that you choose. So you'll get to research your own architecture and bring printouts of it. I want you to create 3 sketches, and I want you to create one of those sketches in the program Tinkercad. With this particular assignment, you can really think about different forms of architecture. You can look at buildings, or you can even break it down as something a little bit more simple, like doorways or arches, windows. So it doesn't have to be, a full-on iconic building, say like the Eiffel Tower in Paris. It could be something as simple as, just an ornate piece of architecture that you find just walking down the street. There's a lot of wiggle room for what you can do with this project. The only thing I ask is that architecture is influencing it, and you're really going to take your own design and run with it. So let's talk a little bit about the idea of architecture itself. Architecture is defined in various ways. First definition, the art or science of building, specifically the art or practice of designing and building structures, and especially habitable ones. It's the formation or construction resulting from or as if from a conscious act, as in like the architecture of a garden or the architecture of a building, the architecture of a city. A unifying or coherent form of structure. A novel that lacks architecture. Architectural product or work, buildings that compromise the architecture of a square. A method or style of building. So for example, Gothic architecture, that's one type of architecture that could potentially be studied. So the big question that we're going to ask with this project is, how do sculpture, architecture, and design influence each other? So let's take a look at a couple of Gothic buildings. This is the Notre Dame Cathedral in France. This was before the fire hit it. As you can see here, the architecture is really gorgeous. There's a lot of intricate, beautiful designs. A lot of really beautiful textures. I think this building is particularly very stunning. And there's several artists that I'm going to cover in this presentation that are heavily influenced by architecture like this. So the first artist we're going to go over, and I really particularly enjoy this artist because not only does she take the architecture that she's influenced by, but she also really runs with it with her own designs. So if you look at the bottom of the screen here, you can see my mouse moving. You see these pieces of architecture right here, and we're going to go back to our previous slide. Can you see how similar it is to the architecture here? So you can see this artist, her name is Diana Al-Hadid, is very heavily influenced by that architecture. And she uses a lot of architecture in her work, but then she'll heavily build off of these. So, the bottom parts of this structure, these are all constructed out of wood, but then she uses a material that's called aqua resin, which kind of acts like plaster, but then when it dries, it's kind of like a rigid, hard plastic. So it's really durable and very strong and structurally sound. So you can see in her sculpture here, she uses a lot of these drip-like forms to kind of create these staircases, but then she also integrates some figures into her work. So it's really interesting just to kind of see how she approaches it. She's also the artist that you all will be looking at in addition to this lecture. She has a really great Art 21, and she really goes in depth on her work. So be sure to watch that as well. Here's a couple more of Diana's pieces. So again, that same architecture, this is another angle of the piece we just looked at, that's coming through in the piece. You can also see it in this one too, the arches here are definitely influenced by that Gothic cathedral look. But then I also think it's really interesting too that it almost looks like a pipe organ. So she kind of is emphasizing that church Gothic theme even more by adding this other element in here. So, she really takes the architectural elements and she really runs with it with her sculptures. Here's a couple more pieces. And again, we're still seeing that Gothic tower type aesthetic going into the work, So here it's kind of like an upside down kind of Tower of Babel type design. Here she has like this staircase, and again, kind of like that church organ look that she had in that last piece. You could see here on the bottom, that's almost like those the pedals that you would use to play an organ. So, she's really taking the architecture and interpreting it in different ways. So, here we're looking at, three different versions of an influence from that Gothic architecture. So, we look at the original, and then we look at image one, and then these two, and then this image. So, again, like 3 sculptures total that we're looking at with the influence of the Gothic cathedral. So the next artist I'm going to talk about also has that Gothic cathedral interest. But, again, this is a completely different interpretation and aesthetic in comparison to Diana El Hadid. So Von Randel, in this case, his Gothic architecture that he's using in his pieces, they're heavily referencing the windows more, that stained glass, as you can see on the image on the right. But, his are all made out of cast metal. And again, since we are working with wood and focusing on wood, we do have a lot of versatility as far as, actually sculpting things. And, you are allowed to mix other media in if it's really important to the idea that you're trying to portray in the assignment. So, Von Randel, in this case, he's using the window architecture, and he's got 2 different interpretations of the Gothic cathedral. So again, that influence really can go in various different ways. Another one influenced by the Gothic cathedral is Willem Dafoe, and his work, he's recreating that Gothic architecture, but then he's turning it into a steamroller or a bulldozer, I'm sorry. And that is a really interesting interpretation of the Gothic cathedral, so you have to think conceptually, what does it mean to turn it into a bulldozer, but then also have this really like kind of Gothic, steampunk aesthetic going with it. Really consider, again, your viewer and what you're trying to communicate to them as far as, what you want your work to be about. So that's really important to think about. Another Willem Dafoe piece. So, this one's a truck kind of speeding away, but, again, that Gothic architecture is being used in this particular piece. This is Jennifer Kirkpatrick. So we're going to start moving away from the Gothic architecture, and we're going to talk about different kinds of architecture that other artists are influenced by. So Jennifer Kirkpatrick, in her work, she tends to use a lot of ornamental imagery, so she'll find like old buildings and find decorative elements, and then she'll start kind of doing like a collage 3-dimensionally and sometimes 2-dimensionally of different architectural pieces. So, if you look over here, she's got a couple different designs. This piece happens to be out of clay, but, this feasibly could be made out of wood as well. And, she's using different elements and collaging together, same with this top piece up here. So she found various pieces of architecture and she kind of collaged it into a new 3-dimensional piece. So, you can pick more than one piece of architecture if you feel like that is really important to your idea. There's definitely a lot of room for interpretation here. Some artists are influenced by the idea of just basic architectural structure. The beams that hold up buildings, how things are supported, things that are a little bit more rigid. And this artist, Jeremy Entwistle, is definitely influenced by the structure of, how buildings are being held up. And, with his work, he does a mixture of various different woods, and then he also has these green elements here. These happen to be cast iron in order to create new architectural structures. So, again, it doesn't have to be an entire building. It can be, simple structures. It can be ornamentation. There's a lot of room for interpretation here. Another artist, Tom Lauerman, he's a professor at Penn State University who specializes in 3D printing, and he's particularly interested in 3D printing with clay. But he also does a lot of work in wood, and his work is heavily, heavily influenced by different interpretations of architecture. So you can see here he's 3D printing a bridge. This is all made out of clay, and so is the one on the left. And he's also created these bridge-like pieces in wood. This one is MDF wood, very similar to what we're going to be using for our project. And he's really interested in the structures and different scales and how they're interpreted in space. So, you could even think about, how scale is really important to the work. What's the difference between making something really large and something really small? Our footprint is 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 foot, but you can really think about how your architecture is influenced by that specific size. And here's another Tom Lauerman piece. This one's a little bit more abstract, but this is made out of wood. And another option for you all to think about, because we have the technology, we can use the laser cutter to cut certain things out, and then we can also use the laser cutter to burn designs into the wood. So this is something that Tom did here, was he used the laser, and he created his designs either in there's various programs you can use. We have Fusion 360, and we have Illustrator. Tom most likely used the program Rhino, but there's various different ways you can do it. Typically, as long as you make it into a vector file, and then you just adjust the machine to the proper settings, you can do cutting or burning. So this is something to think about too if you really want to think about the color contrast. The wood we're using, the MDF, is easy to paint. If you want to use something like really vibrant, bright colors, I'd recommend priming it first after everything's nicely sanded down and ready to go, and then going in and using your actual color. It's kind of got like a matte type color to it. And the reason why we're using this specific wood is because when you introduce other woods into a shop, you have to consider wood grain and how you're going to cut the wood according to the wood grain. And since everyone is learning how to use the wood shop for the first time, I wanted to make it a little bit easier so you didn't have to worry about the grain issue. So that's why we're going to be using the particle board, the MDF, and that'll be a lot easier for everybody to work with. All right, next artist I'm going to talk about uses architectural items of the home, but in his case, he actually uses fabric quite a bit with his work. But the reason why I wanted to show him was because the aesthetic of his looks like really soft and really interesting. So thinking about the idea of architecture and something being soft versus rigid is something to think about as well. So with his particular aesthetic, here's one of his houses. It's interesting because, we're used to a house being like a really rigid structure, but then he's taken it and interpreted it in a different material and made it something really soft. But I thought the way he's using the architecture was really interesting to look at too. So as far as your designs and thinking about the architectural influence assignment, you can also consider what happens if you change the aesthetic look of a building or a structure or a window or ornamentation that you want to work with. What happens when you change that aesthetic, like something that's typically like really rigid and you make it something that's really soft, or something that's like really pretty and ornamental and you make it something that's kind of unsettling to look at. So think about how you want your viewer to interpret your particular piece. Okay, so next artist, he's using the materials in a way where, he's kind of abstracting it a bit, but also kind of creating them so they're like monster-like, anthropomorphic in some ways. So this is Ruben Ochoa. And Ruben Ochoa is using a lot of materials that you'd find in architecture. So, concrete, pallets, wood, rebar. So these are all materials that you'd typically find in, construction sites or, building any structure. But then, again, like we talked about with Dohosu, this works kind of reinterpreting the material to create a different aesthetic than we're used to seeing it. So, again, something that's like a little bit more rigid, like a house or, a structure. Ruben Ochoa ended up making this piece something that's like more organic, So he really considered that change. Another artist is Dimitar Lukyanov, and this artist is really using a lot of line with his work. So he kind of creates architecture that's like a little bit more abstract. So he's using these smaller structures to create larger pieces. And he typically makes these pieces for public view in like the airport. So like the piece over here on the right, this is in JFK, I believe, like Terminal 2, I think. It's one of the international terminals. And then this is a smaller work of his. This piece is about a foot tall, so about the same footprint as you all are working in. And, he's using line to create his own form of architecture. So again, you can abstract it quite a bit if you would like, if you're more interested in working in the formal route. Next artist is Chris Sancombe. And again, another artist that is interpreting architecture in a little bit more of a formal route where, he's really influenced by the material, basic structure, and he's using designs where color is really creating several focal points on this piece. So, he's using the warmer wood tones to kind of create a contrast with the black, more rigid pieces of wood. And then, it's all anchored down by a palette as the final product of the piece that's acting kind of like a pedestal. So, here there's just various different forms of architecture that's kind of growing off one another. Hillel O'Leary is similar too. In his case, ladders were the architectural influence. So these are different ladders, different heights, but then, he brought in these other wooden elements to kind of emphasize more natural things happening, kind of like trees. So his work almost creates these certain kinds of stage sets in a way. So, he's using a mixture of different materials in order to create a different look with this piece. So he's using rope, and then I believe these little red pieces here are made out of metal, but then the rest of the piece is all made out of different kinds of wood. Okay, so we're going to jump back to looking at architecture and different aesthetics. So Anila Rubiku is similar to Dohosu in some ways, but in her case, she has a piece of architecture that's telling more of a narrative. So she has this whole scene embellished on the house here. So all of this where the areas of light are in, they're all carved out. And then, where there's light and the little holes here, those are all drilled in, and then she illuminated it from the interior. So, you can really think about the surface of your piece, kind of like how Tom Lowerman used the laser in order to etch those designs into the wood. This is something you can consider as well. And then another artist, Chiaro Shioda, she's using windows. She made an entire structure out of various windows she found. So she made this kind of like massive, massive tower. So, again, it doesn't have to be an entire particular specific building. You can choose something as simple as a window in order to create your design. And that is the final slide that I have for this presentation. Be sure to follow up on Diana Al Hadid's Art 21, where she will talk about her influences on architecture.